Okay, so we're on to aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is the level of real GDP that firms will produce at each price level in an economy. There are two components to aggregate supply. One is long run supply and short run aggregate supply. So the long run aggregate supply is the period of time where input prices are completely flexible and they adjust to changes in the price level. And in the long run, the level of real GDP supplied is independent of the price level. But as John Maynard Keynes, the British economist that informed a lot of the fiscal policy that's used in the United States and has been used since the Great Depression, in the long run, we're all dead. So he didn't think that an analysis of the long run aggregate supply was particularly important. The short run, however, is a period of time where input prices are sticky and they don't adjust to changes in the price level very quickly. They do adjust, but they don't adjust quickly. And so in the short run, the level of real GDP supplied is directly related to the price level. So long run aggregate supply, or LRAS, it marks the level of full employment. It's a vertical line. And it's very similar to operating on the PPC curve. So when all of your resources are completely utilized, you don't have any underemployed resources like labor, then you would have a vertical long-run aggregate supply curve, or that is the long-run aggregate supply, it's just vertical. And it represents full employment. So sometimes the bottom label of the long-run aggregate supply is labeled also as full employment. So in long-run aggregate supply, changes in the price level don't change a firm's profit, so that doesn't change their level of output. So this is how you draw the long-run aggregate supply, and as you'll note at the bottom of the graph, it's Y sub F, which is the level of full employment in this particular economy. Short-run aggregate supply responds to changes in the price level. That's why it's upward sloping. It reflects the fact that in the short run you have an increase in price level, and that can potentially increase the firm's profits. And so when firms can make more money because of an increase in price level, then that provides an incentive for them to produce more. When prices go down, or the price level, not just prices, the price level goes down, that produces an incentive for firms to produce less because they are earning less profit. So short-run aggregate supply has a positive relationship with an increase in the price level and an increase in real GDP, or their total output. So what happens when you change short-run aggregate supply? An increase in short-run aggregate supply is seen as a shift to the right. A decrease in short-run aggregate supply is seen as a shift to the left. The key to understanding short-run aggregate supply is the per unit cost of production. Okay, so the way per unit cost of production is calculated is the total input cost divided by the total output. So if we want to have an increase in short-run aggregate supply, we shift to the right and label all of our curves. If we want to have a decrease in short-run aggregate supply, we shift to the left and label all. So determinants of short-run aggregate supply affect the unit production cost, which is why the key to understanding short-run aggregate supply relates to the unit production cost. So you have input prices, productivity, and the legal institutional environment, which is a very fancy way of saying, does the government make it easier or harder, more expensive or less expensive for firms to produce? Input prices. So you have domestic resource prices. This is the cost of resources in your economy, in your local economy, at home in the United States for our purposes, because that's simply where we are. And the biggest domestic resource costs for pretty much any business that exists are wages. That's approximately 75% of all business costs. Then you have the cost of capital, which are your machinery, equipment, buildings, etc. And then you have your raw materials cost that you use or that must be purchased or acquired to produce whatever finished good or service that business makes. And you have foreign resource prices. So some businesses use or produce goods or services that use components that they get from abroad instead of just buying all of those pieces here in our local economy. And so with cousin Sid, the strong dollar, you have a strong dollar, more imports, and a trade deficit. So it means there are lower foreign resource prices when businesses import goods from other parts of the world to use to make their finished good or service. And then when you have cousin West, you have a weak dollar, more exports, and a trade surplus. So it makes for higher foreign resource prices when firms use foreign resources to produce whatever their good or service is. You have market power. Monopolies and cartels that control resources control the price of those resources. So a monopoly is a single business that controls the sale of whatever that particular item happens to be, and cartels are like an oligopolic business structure, which means there are 2 or 3, sometimes 4 businesses that control all of one particular industry. So in the United States, oil companies tend to be an oligopoly. We have basically Shell, Exxon, Valero, BP, that's technically a British oil company, but it's one of the oil companies that are definitely present in the United States. And so when you have an increase in resource prices, that's going to shift your short-run aggregate supply curve to the left, because when you increase the resource prices, it increases the cost of producing those things in smaller quantities, or fewer resources, or fewer goods and services, can be produced. And then you have a decrease in resource prices, which allows for the increase in short-run aggregate supply. It allows firms to produce more output. Productivity is another important component of short-run aggregate supply. So productivity is defined by the total output divided by the total inputs. And when you have more productivity, that creates a lower unit production cost, and so that shifts our short-run aggregate supply to the right because it increases our total output. And lower productivity means that we have a higher unit production cost from firms, which will shift the short-run aggregate supply to the left because it decreases the total output. The legal institutional environment is essentially the way that the government influences firms' ability to produce goods and services. So the primary way they do this is through taxes and subsidies. If you go back to the circular flow, taxes is money that is given from businesses to the government, and so it increases the per unit production cost, and that shifts our short-run aggregate supply to the left. Subsidies, that's money from the government to businesses, reduce the unit production cost, and that increases the short-run aggregate supply with the shift to the right. Government regulation, the more regulation there tends to be, the more costs are associated with complying with those regulations, and that shifts our short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. Deregulation reduces compliance costs, and that money can be reallocated to other places in the business, which allows the short-run aggregate supply. It allows firms to produce more and shifts our short-run aggregate supply curve to the right. And that is the end.